As you know, my name is Ron Adler, formerly Kazimierz Henryk Adler, and I'm already 83 years old. I was born in Warsaw, and the first 12 years of my life were spent in an assimilated Jewish family in Warsaw. By assimilated Jewish family, I mean that we spoke Polish at home. We were defined as Poles of Jewish religious inclination. Quite frankly, I had very little with Jewish life, and I would say that my only contact with being Jewish was going to visit my grandparents.
Were they religious?
My grandmother on the father's side came from a religious home, and she was kosher. But my grandfather was a disbeliever who went to a synagogue in order to please my grandmother.
But so there were synagogues close by, or?
There was a synagogue not very far from there, and
where exactly was this? Where were you living exactly?
We were living in Warsaw at the corner of Chorza and Krucha Street, which is in the modern city, or the non-Jewish part of Warsaw.
Was there also a Jewish
Oh
part?
yes, there was a very large Jewish area in Warsaw. Don't forget that about almost 50% of the inhabitants of Warsaw were Jews.
50%?
50%. Warsaw was a city of 1,200,000 inhabitants, and I think 50% of them were Jews who mainly lived in a predominantly Jewish area. And when you went there,
what was that called? What was it called?
Didn't have a name. It was just known as the Jewish area. And when you went there, you could see many people dressed in black, like the religious Jews do, wearing all kinds of hats and so on. My grandfather he was the owner, or the co-owner with his brothers, of a very large apartment house, very large. It had 2 inner courts, and I suppose, I don't know how many flats there were, but they lived on the
rent?
On the front.
Oh.
So I went straight up, and of course from the balcony one could see the Jewish life in Warsaw. Otherwise I had no contact with Jews at all, except that I went to a school which had a a principle of numerus clausus, which means that every denomination by percentage of pupils fixed ahead of time. Now the Jews were limited to 8%, I think, and in a class of 32 students, there were 3 of us. Now, the funny thing is that outside of the school, I didn't have any contact with my classmates, except for the other 2 Jews, with whom we met occasionally. But actually, we led I led as a child a very sheltered life.
What was the life like at home?
The life at home was very well defined. At a certain time, we got up. We had breakfast at a certain time. I would go to school. I went to school alone, and I had to travel by bus something like 15 minutes, maybe 20. And every day I was given 50 groszy, which is like 50 cents. And that was for 2 bus rides, and the 10 cents, the 10 groszy were for me. Well, if I wanted to buy something special, like the sports newspaper, I would go back from school on foot, and then I saved 20 groszy. So
So the family was it middle class? Was it?
The family was typically middle class, and it was well off, but not rich. Definitely not rich.
How big was the apartment?
The apartment had 5 large rooms, and a kitchen and a bathroom.
So you had your own room?
I had a room shared with my brother Janek and the governess. We had I don't know whether you should call her a governess or a nanny, but we had a woman who took care of us during the day.
She lived in?
She lived in the same room.
In the same room?
In the same room.
Was she Jewish?
Well, that's an interesting question. For the first 10 years of my life, they were always Christian. But the last 2 years, my parents engaged a Jewish young lady who came from a poor family, but she was educated and she was intelligent as far as I can remember, and she took care of us. So that was it. My parents, well, I saw them at meal times, not breakfast, but dinner, which was around 3:15 in the afternoon, when my father came back from work. And the evening meal we had on our own in our room, and my parents either went out in the evening, or they had guests in. but we had to go to bed at 8:30 by the latest. The lights off were at 8:30.
There was no television or anything.
No, there was no television. And in the last year, before the World War, I was given an extension of half an hour, so I could go to sleep at 9.
Were there any family gatherings that you remember, like holidays, or was there anything like Passover or anything?
We went for the holidays to my grandparents on my father's side, always. And I remember those gatherings very well. There were my grandparents, my aunts. My father had 2 brothers, but the older one, who was a physician and an officer in the army, died before I was born. And I had a very interesting sequence to this when I first came to New York, but more about that later on. And my other uncle was not permitted in the grandparents' home because he took over the elder brother's wife, and that was a shocking thing to do. And my grandparents excluded him from family life. So anyway, but those were occasions where we always had a typically holiday meal with conversation and so on.
And did you go traveling at all? Like, did you go on vacations, go to visit other relatives?
Yes, I went every year. I went once or twice a year to visit my aunt and uncle in a small town near Warsaw. And the reason why I went there was that they had a son who was a year older than I was, and we were very good friends. So I went there willingly. And my uncle was a physician, and he would receive patients. It was very interesting because his patients were, at least part of them, were people from the country, from the countryside, and instead of paying him, they would bring him 2 geese or 2 ducks or 5 dozen eggs and things like that. So that was a completely different kind of life to what we had in Warsaw. We also went every year during the summer. We went away for 2 months when the school was out, and my parents rented an apartment or a house in one of the places that were considered holiday resorts.
Yeah. And where was that?
Oh, all over Poland. There was. We went to Skolimów, which was something like 25 kilometers from Warsaw. We went to Kazimierz, which was something like 100 kilometers from Warsaw. and we went twice to the seaside on the shores of the Baltic Sea in a place called Orlovo, and that was between Gdansk and Gdynia. I remember all those things reasonably well.
Did you ever travel outside of Poland back then?
I never traveled outside of Poland. My father went from time to time to abroad on business. He represented in Poland two different firms, one from Austria and one from England. So he went abroad, but...
what was his profession?
Well, by profession he was a graduate of the School of Economics in Berlin. There was a time when I doubted whether he finished his studies. And I was very ashamed when after the war he asked to be sent a diploma, and he received it and we sold it. So it was perfectly kosher from the University of Berlin. So,
but he was in the business of...
but he was in the business on his own. He was also a partner in a store for sports goods.
But he was in business on leather goods, right? Or something like that?
Yes, he was in leather. He was in leather, and because my grandfather's family were the owners of a tannery, a very large tannery in Radom, 150 kilometers from Warsaw, and it was apparently a very thriving business.
Did you have a car then, or did you have...
No. In those days...
How did you get from place to place?
Well, there were buses, trams inside the city, trains outside of the city. Two of my father's friends had cars, and from time to time we went for a ride with them, but generally speaking, we used public transport or a droshke, a cart pulled by horses.
So the life was good then?
Life was good.
So when did you have any idea that something was maybe wrong, or when was the first time that you saw, that you felt
look,
like anything...
First of all, Poland was a very anti-Semitic country. One could feel the anti-Semitism almost in the street.
in school?
In school, I had several incidents when I was offended. Once I hit someone who offended me, and I spilled a hot cocoa on his face, and I was expelled from school. But after 4 days, they called me back and returned me to school, because they apparently they believed my story that he provoked me. So, but of course, the very fact that none of my classmates have ever invited me to their homes, and they never visited me, was an indication sufficient.
But were there any of the pogroms or anything like that you remember?
No, in Warsaw we didn't have pogroms. No, we didn't have pogroms.
Did you hear about other things?
What?
Did you hear about things going on?
I heard about things, yes. Beginning in the 30s, in 1930s, after Hitler came to power in Germany, we started being scared of being invaded by Germany. And it happened on the 1st of September of 1939.
Before that, did you ever see any Nazis, or did you ever hear about them, or did they?
Well, during our visit to the seaside in Orlovo, we went to two places. One was called Sopot, and the other one was called Gdansk. Both were towns which were governed by Poland, but they were German-speaking towns with a fairly large population of Germans living there. In fact, I think that they had a German majority at the time. And there, for the first time, I saw the Nazis in brown shirts and with a swastika on the sleeve, marching and singing their songs. And I must say that was very, very scary. And it was something like a foretaste of things to come. And we lived in fear of Germany invading Poland because we heard Hitler's speeches, not that I could understand them, but I could understand his screaming on the radio. There was no television in those days. And even I, as a child, was very afraid of the Nazi Germany.
So was there any plan or any thought of what to do if they invaded or anything like that? Or?
There was no plan to do when they invaded. In fact, my parents had a huge trunk stuffed with all kinds of food which was non-perishable. And I think that we could live on that food for a long time. Eventually, it was all left at home, no one used it. Well, we didn't, we never used it.
So they were preparing for something else, they were preparing maybe to be stuck at home.
Oh yes, they definitely planned to stay at home. But it turned out differently. Well, in a moment I'm going to tell you how it happened, but even today I don't really understand my parents' considerations when they left home. Anyway.
But before that, they started. When you first started encountering the war, it was bombings of Warsaw. When was the first encounter with the actual war?
Germany invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939, and on the very first day, Warsaw was bombed several times. Not in our area, but in various areas. We heard it very distinctly. And we heard that the German army entered Poland. And on the 3rd of September, England first, or Britain first, and France later declared war on Germany because they had a pact of mutual her help with Poland. And when Poland was invaded, they declared war on Germany. And we felt for a short while that we were safe. If the great powers, such as Britain and France, declared war on Germany, that meant that we were saved. Well, things turned out completely differently. On the 6th of September, which was after 6 days of war, in the evening, my parents told me that that they rented a lorry, a truck, together with some of their friends, and they packed 2 suitcases, and at night we left Warsaw.
But at that point, were the Germans already in Warsaw? Were the
No,
Nazis in
no,
Warsaw?
no.
So what did you feel that was that it was you just felt you just heard bombings in other parts of the city?
We heard bombings in the other parts of the city. We heard bombings closer to us. We understood that the Germans were advancing into Poland.
By the radio, you heard on the radio?
I don't exactly remember how I heard it, but I heard it. I remember that. But you see, my parents probably knew more about it, and they decided to leave Warsaw and try to go east. Well,
East meaning towards Russia.
Towards Russia, yes, towards the Russian border. My mother had a family in the east of Poland, and that was where we headed for.
Did you know the family from before? Or?
I knew some members of the family when they came to Warsaw. I've never been to Kowel. Never. But
and this is Dubi's family.
This is Dubi's family, yes. My grandfather on my mother's side grandmother, great-grandmother on his father's side were brothers and sisters. So, we were second cousins of his mother. Anyway, we got into this truck, and it was in the middle of the night, and we could see that the Poles were retreating. We could see some army units in disorder.
But you don't remember what went into that whole decision to leave? I mean, it's the biggest decision of their life.
I had absolutely no idea, and I still don't know. They never told me straight out what made them leave, but they left.
But did you feel that you were leaving and not coming back? Or
No.
You just took some things to. It felt temporary.
I didn't put anything at all. My parents did. They assembled 2 suitcases, and later on it turned out that all the valuables and all the best, like my mother's best clothes, fur coat, and so on, were in those 2 suitcases.
Because they wanted to be able to sell it for money?
They wanted, first of all, to save it, probably. But afterwards, it turned out that those were the means for their survival during the war, by selling them. I didn't know that at the time at all. Anyway, we got to a little town called Siedlce, something like 25,000-30,000 inhabitants, and there we caught the most terrible bombing that I ever went through. One could see the bombers, the Junker planes coming upon this little town, and we could see the bombs actually falling out of the planes. And one bomb fell on the house where we were hiding in the doorway. There was a terrible explosion. We could see the rear part of the house collapsing, and we all jumped out in the street, and it was terrible. All the glass fell out of the windows. There were people bleeding, wounded, probably dead. I didn't realize what it was, and we ran towards a square where there were ditches dug in as a protection against aircraft bombing. And I remember distinctly that my father fell asleep, and my mother woke him up, and she was very angry. She said, "How can you sleep when there are bombs falling around?" And she said, "What can I do?" So, and you know, it's stuck in my memory. I can still see it. But of course, our truck was destroyed in the bombing, or it didn't have any fuel to go.
How far was this from Warsaw now?
30 kilometers.
Oh, so you didn't make it that far.
We didn't make very far. Well, we were in Siedlce, and the truck was lost, and we had to travel by renting horse and cart from the peasants, and they would take us to the next village. And so we went on for quite a few days. I don't remember exactly how many, but quite a few days. And every time, something like 7, maybe 8 kilometers. Eventually, we got to a little village on the banks of the river Bug, and we didn't realize that Germans were about 4 kilometers from there by then, and it was a Friday, and this Jewish family invited us, my parents and I, to stay for the Shabbat.
Did you run into other Jews that were running away, or were you on your own then?
Up to then we were on our own.
Well, what did other Jews do during that period?
I don't know.
You don't know?
I don't know.
So when they left home in the first, it was just you who went into that truck? Just you? Just your family or other families?
My family and 4 other families.
And including your grandparents, or?
No. None of our own family left with us. They all stayed in Warsaw. Just our immediate family that went.
And did anybody of those that stayed, did any of those survive?
None. Absolutely none.
So how many brothers and sisters did your mother have and your father?
My mother had 7 sisters and 2 brothers, a large family. And her mother died at 40-something. So she was the youngest. And I think she was only 10 years old when her mother died. So she was without a mother. Her father didn't remarry. All her sisters and her brothers married and had children. And I got to know them all at one time or another.
So which one was Joseph? Was that your father's father?
Joseph
or your mother's?
was my father's father. Oh, he was
He had a very serious look in that picture that I remember.
He had a very serious look. He was a so distinguished looking gentleman. He held himself very stiffly. When we came to visit, or if he came to visit us, which was very, very rare, they expected me to kiss his hand, and he would pat my head. There were no easy relations between us, but I remember him very well.
Okay, so now you're on your own with the family and where did you get to?
We got to the River Bug, which it transpired later was the border between the Russians and the Germans, according to the treaty that they signed, which was known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. They signed it in 1939, before the war broke out. And according to the Russian version of it, they wanted to gain time to prepare for war. I think that they also wanted a piece of Poland. But those are only speculations. There are historians who wrote about it. And
so where were you sleeping in those? You would travel, and then where did you stay? And you stayed. You said with this family, the Jewish family that took you in, or other families that took you in?
No, we never stayed anywhere. And when we were offered to stay for the Shabbat on Friday, my parents decided that they wouldn't stop. And we crossed the River Bug.
So you just slept while you were traveling?
Yeah. And we crossed the River Bug, and on the other side, the last cart and horse left us, and we started walking. It was still something like 50, 60 kilometers from Kowel.
How old were your parents then?
My father was born in 1892, so he would have been 39 and 8. He was 47, and my mother was 37. She was 10 years younger than he was.
And they were in good shape to carry the suitcases and walk?
No, they were in no shape to carry suitcases. And that is why we kind of stopped and we waited until a big horse and cart came, and on that horse and cart was the family of a friend of my father's, and he begged them to take the suitcases and my mother and Janek onto the cart.
Just by chance you were walking on the road and you saw them by chance?
Yes. He later became a well-known producer in Israel, theater producer. And very shortly after that, when we were walking and they were riding, and we got attacked by a German fighter plane. One of the dive bombers took us, and which dived and shot at us, and we hid in a ditch. And all around us were the empty shells.
So this, you and this other family?
Yeah. But we all survived. No one was wounded. I don't know how. The plane...
Who was the other family? What was their name?
I don't remember the details of the family, but they were the family of my father's friend.
Okay.
And that's how we got to Kowel.
So with that horse and carriage you got to Kowel. So you were walking next to it and they were riding in it?
Yeah.
Because there was not space for all of you?
No. So we got to Kowel, and we stayed with an uncle and aunt of mine, or I call them uncle. They were second uncle, aunt.
And who are these now? Sofka and Tadek, or no? Their
No,
parents?
that was Sofkar's father's brother.
And did they know you were coming?
No.
So,
We just arrived.
So you just showed up.
And we just showed up, and they gave us a room, the four of us, a room which was which couldn't be locked because it was a room through which one went to another part of the house, and from a very large apartment with 5 large rooms, we all of a sudden found ourselves in a tiny little room where there was hardly room to sleep. But some of the house was requisitioned by Russian authorities, the Russians were already in there, and for the next few months, we lived under a Russian communist regime, which was a shock in itself, especially for a boy like me, who was going to start going to a secondary school, high school, and
you were 11 there, or 12?
I was 13.
13?
12 and a half. And I went to school.
You went to school in Kowel?
In Kowel.
But Yannick did not go to school?
Yannick didn't go to... She was under...
How old was he?
I think he was 7. Maybe he went to school. I don't remember that. He probably remembers. He remembers everything. So...
I think he said that you went to school, but his mother wouldn't let him go to school. For some reason, I don't remember.
That I don't know.
Okay.
Anyway, I went to school, and I even got a job coaching another Jewish boy from one of the lower grades mainly in math, because he had difficulty. So, and I got paid for it. So that was an innovation. And we stayed with the family as on the basis of kind of poor relations.
So Kowel at that point was taken over by the Russians, and
Yes.
so you were not afraid of the Germans in that time.
No, the Germans didn't get
But
that.
Kowel later or before also was part of Poland.
Kowel was part of Poland, yes. Kowel was part of Eastern Poland. And I remember during those 6 months, my parents considered going back to Warsaw. It was possible. And my aunt wrote in a code that was probably agreed upon between them. I don't remember that. That under no circumstances were they to return home.
So things were bad in.
So things were beginning to be bad in Warsaw.
And why didn't the others leave? Why didn't other parts of the family come to Kowel, or they couldn't leave anymore?
They couldn't leave anymore. No one could
Once the
leave.
Germans got into.
Once the
Were the
Germans
Germans in Warsaw at that point already?
Oh yes. Oh yes.
How soon after you left did the Germans go into Warsaw?
12 days.
So you were really running away from.
From the advancing
From the
Germans, yes. 12, 14 days afterwards. And we stayed in Kowel, and
Who else was in Kowel?
there were some other members of the family. There was Sofka's father, and who was a physician, and his wife, and Sofka's stepsister arrived there, and there was the local family whom we met.
Was Gutka related to that part of the family then?
Oh,
Or not?
yes.
So she was.
We stayed with her father.
You stayed with her father, separate from. Oh no, because she was related to. She was part of the same family.
She was part of the same family.
Right.
She was my second cousin.
So the whole story is later. Her story when her parents were killed and all that happened later.
That happened later.
After
yes.
you left.
Yes,
So-
she was. They were all still alive, very much alive.
So then you left Kowel. Why did you leave Kowel?
Well, at some stage of the game, the Russians called my father and said, "Would you like a Soviet citizenship?" And he said, very innocently, he said, "No, I want to go home after the war, to Warsaw." They didn't say anything. He was put down as refused Soviet citizenship, and one day at night, the Russian authorities, the KGB or the NKVD as it then was, came to the house, woke everyone up, gave my immediate family, my father, my mother, and I and Yannick, they gave us half an hour to pack and be outside. And one of my aunts tried to reason with them, and he hit her on the hand, and they said, "Do you know whom you're begging for? You're begging for the enemies of the people." So anyway, they got us to a railway station. We didn't know where we were going, and
So only you were single, just the family,
only the four of us.
and the rest were allowed to stay there, or actually they didn't have a choice but to stay there.
It was their own. When we got to the station, there were more people like ourselves. In fact, they filled a whole train, which was composed of goods carriages, not passenger cars. And each one of those carriages had kind of a toilet made out of planks of wood, not separated from the remainder of the truck. And we were about 30 people inside, all strangers to us. And the family came to the station, and I remember seeing them begging the Russians to leave us behind. And especially my uncle Sofka's father, who was a physician and he was well known in the town, he begged the Russians to leave us. And they said nothing doing. They took us and locked the carriages, and we went. And we went east.
So, but this really, in the end, this really saved you, right? Because all of that family got killed.
Well,
All the family in-
Sofka.
Well, not Sofka, but her.
Sofka,
Right.
Sofka escaped, and Gutka escaped, but all those people who stayed behind, including this uncle who begged to be for us to be left behind, all of them perished. All of them were killed.
Because at some point the Germans took over.
The Germans
back?
took over and they exterminated all the Jews. And we went on this goods train for maybe 15 days. And
You didn't know where you were going.
we didn't know where we were going. We crossed the border into Ukraine, or what was Ukraine was then part of the Soviet Union, but it was a republic. And at first people didn't want to use the lavatory because it was exposed to everyone. But nature, excuse me, nature is stronger, and people lost the feeling of being ashamed, and they sat and did whatever they had to do in front of everyone. Eventually, after maybe something like 10 days, they stopped from time to time and let us get out. And
What were you eating then?
they gave us something to eat, but
So it was a cargo train.
Cargo train.
But with soldiers.
there were guards,
guarding it.
guarding.
And the guards gave you food and.
Yes, very little of it, but anyway, we could see that we were going further and further east, and we crossed the Ural Mountains.
This was now. This must have been. This was what time of year was this?
This was June.
So this is already a year later. After you left in September '39. This was 1 year
June
later.
40.
June 40. And so it was summer.
Yes, it was summer. And we could see that we were crossing into Siberia. We went on, and eventually we got to a place which was the last railway station of the line.
No.
So we arrived at Asino, the last stop of the railway
In Siberia.
in somewhere in Siberia, north of a town called Tomsk, which you can see on the maps. It's one of the few large towns in Siberia. That was about 120 kilometers north of Tomsk. There was nothing around except for the railway station. They told us that the camp where we were going to live was about 5 kilometers away from there, and we should slowly walk. So
What was it, hot or cold? What was the weather when you went?
no, the weather was reasonably warm.
Okay.
Anyway, my parents started walking, and I almost ran. I wanted to get first to the camp and catch the best possible place. So I almost ran all the way and saw the camp. And in the camp there were buildings built of tree trunks, which looked very solid, and planks, which didn't look solid. So I went for the solid buildings, and I got in. There were kind of sleeping places, 2 levels, like you had for the girls. And I got what I thought was the best place in the camp. My parents eventually arrived, and then we realized that I made a wrong choice, because there were bugs in the wood. And the whole place crawled with them, and you couldn't get rid of them. That was it. So eventually we moved to one of the barracks made of planks, much newer, constructed for new inhabitants, and there they were kind of platforms on which people were supposed to sleep, and we got a corner of the platform. It was an open hall with something like maybe 200 people in it.
There were already people there.
No, they all arrived on the train with us.
So the camp was empty when you got there?
Yes. Later there came other people, but the camp was, at that time, was empty. And we lived, sort of kind of a communal life, which was terrible. I remember my mother used to get up at very early in the morning, before other people woke, and she would take a large bowl of water, strip to the waist and wash herself, and she couldn't care less whether people looked at her or not looked at her. She wanted to remain clean, and this she did this not every day maybe, but every 2 days, and we stayed there for at least 2 months. During that time, my father started working as a bookkeeper for a tree producing company. They were felling trees, dragging them to the river. Eventually the river froze, and when it thawed again, The trunks of the trees would go down the river to another place where they were caught, transferred to a train, and used as for building. And we found out very quickly that this was an area where there were several camps. Some were detention camps like ours, and some were prison camps for people who were sentenced to various times in prison for political crimes. Like, for instance, we spoke to a person who was a professor of Russian literature at the University of Moscow, and he got 20 years imprisonment for expressing himself unfavorably to the Soviet regime.
Was everybody Jewish in the camp?
No, there were also non-Jewish people, but the majority were Jewish. Anyway, we were eventually moved to a new barrack, which was divided into rooms for families, and the division was by planks of wood, so you could hear everything around, but we had some kind of a privacy. And there was a curfew. We had to struggle for food. We were given a little patch on which we could grow potatoes. I had no idea how to grow potatoes, but I planted some potatoes, and but I mainly, when the time came for the harvest, I mainly stole from the Russian Guards' plots, so that we would have potatoes to eat. The only thing that was plentiful as far as food was concerned was the sour cabbage. Sour cabbage was almost given away from barrels, and you can imagine.
Like pickled?
Pickled cabbage, yes. And you can imagine how quickly you get tired of it. And we got something like 1 loaf of bread a day, and my mother would cut it into 28 slices, so that each one of us would receive 7 slices a day. And I remember Yannick crying when he saw that my mother cutting the bread. He would cry and say, "I'm always getting the smallest portion of everyone." But of course everyone got the same, but he felt that he was badly done for.
What about health? Was there any doctors, or were there?
There were quite a few doctors amongst the prisoners. There was a hospital, which fortunately we didn't use. But yes, there was medical attention. There was a hospital, primitive, but a hospital.
And what did you all think on a day-to-day basis? Were you all nervous every day or scared what's going to happen next?
Well, we got used to it.
Did you feel like you made the right choice? Were you doubting?
No, we felt that we were in very bad very bad conditions. The winter came, and the temperature got down to 45 centigrade below zero, which is something terrible. And at one time there were 53 degrees below zero. And you couldn't go out without rubbing your nose because otherwise it would freeze and that would be that. That would be that. It was terrible. I went to school there.
School inside the camp?
No, outside the camp. And
So what was outside? Outside there were some villages, or
there were other camps, and there were there was a camp for the families of the guards, a big camp where their families stayed with them. So we couldn't enter that camp at all. Anyway, that's how we lived for quite a long time. Very, very, very difficult life. And then in July of 1941, after just over a year there, the war broke out between Germany and Russia. Germany attacked Russia, and a month later, the Russians called us, called everyone who was in the camp for a meeting, and they declared that we were no longer prisoners, and we could do whatever we liked, because we stopped being citizens of a country which was the enemy of the Soviet Union. So, but of course it was easier said than done, because in Russia, in Soviet Russia, one couldn't travel to wherever one wanted. You had to have a permit. A permit was not easily given. You had to prove that you had a purpose, but eventually we got a permit, and we started moving south. And my parents, first of all, wanted to move away from this cold area. Secondly, there were rumors that a Polish army was forming in the south of Russia. And we spent a difficult year in Uzbekistan, being hungry most of the time, because my parents no longer had any valuables to sell. Well, it's not exact. They still had some things to sell, and that's how we survived. We didn't have any other means to survive. Eventually, the Polish army started forming in the south of Russia, and I became an officer cadet in the Polish army.
Wait, but you must have.
I was
you were
15. I was 15.
So in 15, and what do you mean? This is the Polish army, but it wasn't in Poland.
No.
But,
This was the
like
Polish army
in
which was
exile, like trying to take back
yes,
Poland.
yes.
And who was organizing it?
A general by the name of Anders, who was serving the Polish exiled government in London.
So this was in Uzbekistan,
Yes.
and they were just taking anyone who said that they were Polish, or that.
One had to prove that he was Polish, but
But they didn't care about your age.
wasn't very difficult. But you see, I said officer cadet. I don't know what you call it in English, but there in Hebrew you say perach ktsuna. which is a term reserved for young people who were educated to become officers in the army. And there were exactly 2 of us Jews amongst 600 non-Jews. But the advantage of it was that I could immediately get food from the camp, and every night I would carry it to my parents who lived outside the camp, something like 3 or 4 kilometers, and I could bring them food. So this was something new. The army had food. And eventually they started about talking about the Polish army leaving Russia.
But at some point, didn't the parents also move into the camp with?
No.
So they were living. They just came there so you could go to the army.
Yes. I was the only one who could go to the army.
And the the reason was because then you could get food, or you could get.
Oh yeah. I could get food, and I had a chance to leave Russia. And the moment came when.
Did they get anything as a family of the army?
Not at that stage. Not at that stage. Much later than they did, but at that stage they didn't get anything. And eventually the Polish army left Russia through the Caspian Sea to Persia, to Iran. And at first they didn't take the Jewish families with them. They took the other soldiers' families with them, but the Jewish families were not taken. And it was only after 48 hours that they had second thoughts about it, and they also took my parents and some of the other Jewish families and transferred them to Persia. Now, I wasn't together
Persia
with
is Iran.
Iran. From there, they went to Tehran, and from there they came to Palestine by the way of East Africa.
How did they get around?
The British sent them. The British helped them. During the war, there was no immigration into Palestine, so there were immigration certificates available, and the British gave them an immigration certificate that they could come to Palestine.
So this was what I heard from Yannick, and I was just trying to understand. So your parents and Yannick came to Israel not because they were Jewish or because they wanted to make Aliya or anything, just because they were they were your family, and the Polish army wanted to bring them here.
Oh, of course, yes. They didn't have any Zionists.
And it was almost by chance that they came here. They could have been taken other places.
I think that they had some say in it, but not. I wasn't with them, so I don't really know.
But they basically came as the family of a Polish.
Oh yes,
Polish
definitely, very definitely.
And you were already going in another direction then.
And I was, first of all, it was such a shock that after being hungry for years, they brought us the future officer cadets they brought us to a camp, to a British camp, and they said, now, first of all, they disinfected us. We had to throw away all our clothes on a huge fire. We stayed naked, and all we could remain with were our personal documents in one hand and a belt in the other hand. And we were shaved. There were soldiers who stood there and shaved us everywhere. And they disinfected us with DDT and other things. And they took us to a bath, to a public bath, and we had a great big bath for something like an hour. And when we were clean, we were given clean clothes, and we were not allowed to go back to the area from which we came anymore. So, because all our clothes were infested with what do you call them? Bugs.
Lice?
Lice, with lice. And there in one go we got rid of the lice, and then we were brought to a huge tent, and we were told that there is food in the tent. Don't eat too much, because there will be food in the future. But after being hungry for such a long time, and I got to the stage when they asked me at one time, before I became this officer cadet, when we were hungry all the time, when they asked me on my birthday if it were possible to buy you a present, what would you like? I never hesitated. I said, a loaf of white bread all to myself. Anyway, we got back to leaving, having left Russia. We were brought to this tent, and when we came in, it was like, for us it was like a dream. All around the tent there was food, like meat, spam, corned beef, cheese, all kinds of things. And of course we overate, but that was obvious. And I was parted from my parents. My parents went to Tehran, and I went with the army to Iraq, and I wanted to get away from the Poles.
To get away from the Polish army?
Yeah. And
did you participate in any fighting, or?
No, but eventually I was sent to England.
Yeah, so how did the transfer happen from the Polish army to the British?
I said that I refused to serve in the Polish army.
So this is how long after this whole thing? This is already, your parents were here now.
Yeah.
The family was here. They were living in Israel, and then you said that you wanted to leave the Polish army?
Yes. And they sent me to...
But you didn't speak any English, or you didn't?
Oh, I did.
Oh, you did? From what? From school?
I had an aunt who taught me at an early age. She worked for foreign embassies, and I knew some But of course, when I arrived in England, I could say maybe a few very simple sentences, but not beyond that.
So how did you exactly get to England?
By ship from
But what?
Alexandria.
But with the Polish army still, or no?
I was still with the Polish army, but when I got to England, I joined I left the Polish army. I joined the British. They sent me for training, and I started a period in England when I was away from my parents, and I stayed away from them for something like 11 years.
Wait, so I still am on this. So you were in the Polish army sent you to England in order to fight alongside England, or?
Yes.
And then when you got to England, then you found the opportunity to try and join the British Army.
Yes.
And the British Army took you. I mean, you were not British. You had no citizenship. You had nothing.
I had no citizenship at the beginning, but they took me. Of course, they took everyone who could serve in the army. I added 2 years to my age, so that they would take me. No one checked the papers. I didn't have any papers anyway. And I started a new life.
So
I still remember vividly, England was still at war with Germany. The Germans bombed England almost every day.
So you were there during the...
Not during the Blitz, but during the war, yes.
What year was this now?
43.
43. And when your parents came to Israel in 42?
No, they came in 42, yes. 42. And maybe beginning of 43. Beginning of 43. And
so going into the British Army allowed you to stay in Britain?
yes. And then in the meantime, the war ended. And
so you were in England until after 45?
oh, yes, I stayed in
And
England.
what were you doing in those years in the beginning? You were still in the British Army?
I was released to a camp where they were giving everyone an opportunity to complete secondary education, which was interrupted by war. So it was a military camp, but which provided food and accommodations, but we could study in order to take a matriculation certificate.
So this was because and during all those years you missed high school.
That's why
So they let you study to catch up.
Yes. And this was a very crammed course, and eventually in 1946 I got a matriculation certificate, and in England at that time there was a different matriculation certificate for every university. So I took a matriculation examination for the University of London, but also for the northern universities. So it was like matriculation certificate twice. And I was released from the army, and I started to look for a place where I could study.
They gave you citizenship then?
Not yet. Not yet. And I took a competition examination for the London School of Economics, which at that time was very, very famous. I didn't realize how famous it was. There were 250 candidates and I came out fourth. I didn't believe it. It was a general exam of general knowledge. But probably I must have been good at geography and things like that. But anyway, I came out fourth. And I could enter the London School of Economics by virtue of that. But I thought that one could never exist and earn money out of London School of Economics. It transpired later on that I didn't know what I was doing, because the graduates of London School of Economics all made fantastic careers. But I wanted something which I could earn money for. So I went to and I did a year of textile engineering in Halifax Technical College. Then I got tired of that and I switched to civil engineering with an option of surveying, and I started doing that, but my funds ran out. So I had to do something which would give me funds to keep me studying. And the British Army took me in for regular army service. I signed for 5 years in the regular army, and they let me go on studying. And then I had to serve for the remaining years until I got my degree. And in 1952, I finished, I got a degree, but I still had a year to serve in the army. And I had to serve another year in the army, in the regular army, and I was already getting money for it. And I even came to visit my parents in 1952 for 2 weeks, and went back.
Were you in touch with them the whole time? You were...
Not all the time, but most of the time, yes. Like, for instance, they sent me to, the regular army sent me to Egypt, and from Egypt I couldn't communicate with them. So that was out. But eventually I was released from the army and I had my degree and I came here and started living. The rest is not interesting. But I'll go back to almost to where I started, and I said this before, you heard it, Emily and Sivan did not, that I gave a talk on all these things at in the classroom of Shelley. You know, 12, 13-year-old girls and boys. And they gave me an hour and I spoke for an hour about all these things. For the first time in my life. And I said to them that if I had to give a name to my talk, I would say fate. Because all the time during the war, only fate made us survive. And look, when we ran away from the Germans, we got to the Russians. The Russians decided that we were enemies of the people and sent us to Siberia. All the family wanted us to stay with them, and they sent us to a place which was terrible. But we are the only ones who survived. The only ones out of the whole family who survived. So what can I call this? A foresight? No one could see what was going to happen. But so unfortunately, I must say that it was fate.
But also knowing when to make small decisions at the right moment.
Oh yes, but look, we make small decisions every day.
Yeah.
So
Knowing how to adapt.
small decisions are easy.
Yeah, but I mean, small decisions like joining the Polish army, joining the British army, those leaving home, those are not easy decisions.
No. But you know, I went through many difficult things in my life, but as I said at our meeting in honor of our 30th anniversary with Ahuva, I said that the fate smiled at me, because eventually I not only survived, but I achieved what every person wants to achieve in life. A reasonable income, security, satisfaction in my profession. I got to the highest level. At one time, I was perhaps in the top 25 people professionally in the world. So it was. In the end, the fate smiled at me.
So one last thing is about the visit back to Poland.
Oh.
If you have a few more energy for a few
Yes.
minutes.
At the time when I was at the height of my career, the Polish Academy of Science invited me to Poland to give a lecture at the to the Polish Academy of Sciences, and to see Poland at their expense, and I went. I went with Ahuva. From the moment we arrived until the moment we left, we had red carpet treatment. They treated us like kings. They took me to the first thing from the airport. They took us to a house where I lived. I got out of the car. They said, "This is where the house where you lived." I got out. I said, "This is the address where I live, but this is not the house in which I lived." And then they told me, "Yes, you're right, because the house was destroyed or almost destroyed during the war, and then it was rebuilt." But I went to various places, including the only synagogue in Warsaw where my grandfather went in order to satisfy my grandmother. The synagogue was closed. Ahuva banged on the door and screamed in Yiddish that open immediately. A man from Israel came to visit you and you don't open the door? And they opened the door. And eventually the person in charge came and gave us a tour of the synagogue, a private tour of the synagogue. And then I said, I want to go and see where my grandparents lived. And I knew where to go. I turned right and I went maybe for a block and a half. And there the street ended and there were residential houses there. Nothing like the Jewish quarter, So I said, the Poles have destroyed the Jewish quarter so that there will be nothing left to remember. Apparently this was heard by the head of the Polish military mapping establishment, and he invited me to come and see something. So I went. He was a general in the Polish army. And he said, you can read aerial photographs, we know that. So here's a pair of photographs of the area in which you are interested in, taken in 1945, immediately after the war. There was not a single building standing where my grandparents lived. Absolutely nothing. So the Poles didn't destroy the area. They built.
The Germans did before they left.
The Germans first, during the uprising in the ghetto, and then the Russians by bombing Warsaw, what was left of it, before they came in. The Russians did this deliberately. But anyway, I was given a red carpet treatment. I went to a concentration camp, where I believe my immediate family was exterminated, Treblinka. And I gave a lecture at the Polish Academy of Sciences, and I wanted to speak. I wanted to speak English because that was a language that I could express myself professionally. But they said, "We hear you speaking Polish. Everyone will be grossly offended if you speak to us in English. Speak in Polish." I said, "But I don't know the terminology in Polish." So they said, "Never mind, we'll help you out with the terminology, and you can use your English transparencies." So I gave a lecture to the Polish Academy of Sciences in Polish. I used English terms for professional things, and after 7 days, I left Warsaw, I left Poland, and I said to Ahuva, "I'm leaving a country in which I feel a stranger, except for the fact that I know the language." And this is exactly how I felt. I felt completely a stranger, in spite of the fact that I was received like a king. There was it's very funny. We were in a hotel, and we had breakfast in the morning. And Ahuva wanted some tomatoes. So I said to the waitress, "Would you bring some tomatoes for my wife?" And she turned to her and spoke Polish to her. So I said to the waitress, "I'm sorry, my wife doesn't speak Polish." She says, "How can you live with her if she doesn't speak Polish?" So, anyway, that was just one example. I went to see the school where I went to. I looked at the building, and the building seemed much smaller than I remember it. To me, it was a huge building. But people explained to me that I remember the building through the eyes of a child, and I came as a grown-up person. So, but the summary of the thing was that I visited a strange country of which I knew the language, and I would never go back to, I would never dream to go back to Poland for sentimental reasons.
Did it feel good to be received like that?
Oh yes, very definitely so. After all the knowing Polish anti-Semitism at first hand, it was a paradox of fate that a Jew and Israeli would have such a red carpet treatment in Poland. That's life.
Okay, that's a good place to end.
Yeah,
No?
I think it's a very good place to end.
Excellent. you.